I'm joined by our esteemed naturalist, Paul Wiegman, and we're going to be talking about watershed conservation.
Watershed conservation.
Why is watershed conservation important?
Because you have to think of a watershed as a place. It's an irregular bowl, and everything that happens in the watershed ultimately flows through the watershed and out the end of the watershed. So it's sort of like the circulatory system of a body. If you're putting some pollutants or something into one part of the circulatory system, it's moving through the whole body. Ultimately, what goes through the watershed, what starts at the top of the watershed, ends up going all the way through it. So it's important that we keep the watershed as clean as possible.
Now, Paul, there's a term called the riparian zone.
The riparian zone. Right?
What is the riparian zone?
Think of it this way. You have dry land and you have wet water. The area between the really dry land and the really wet water is the riparian zone. It's that transition zone.
The transition zone.
Yeah, so
okay.
you'll go from moist soils to wet soils to saturated soils to soils that are a little bit submerged or maybe get submerged in spring floods on out into deep water where there's nothing growing underneath.
Okay.
So that riparian zone is a zone of transition from terrestrial to aquatic.
And what's the big important part of watershed conservations that people need to understand as far as making it a priority as developers come through and a sort of a long-range plan? Why is it important then to pay attention to watersheds?
A couple things. First of all, the water moving through it. You have surface water and you have groundwater, and the more pervious surfaces you have, the places that rainwater can flow into the ground and not rush off quickly and get into the groundwater, then slowly be released, is very, very important. If you have a watershed that happens, when it rains, the stream goes up very little because a lot of the water is being absorbed by the land, but it's also being absorbed in that riparian zone. And the floodwaters come up a little bit, they deposit some silt, and they go down a little bit. But if you have a lot of impervious surfaces, that water rushes off quickly, the streams go up fast, they scour the riparian zone, remove vegetation, and you have flooding. So you have to find the perfect balance in development that you cut down on the number of impervious surfaces so you maintain that water cycle and that water infiltration and then its slow release.
And when you talk about impervious, we're talking about like concrete,
pavement, asphalt, building roofs, and grass. Everybody thinks, oh, it's green grass, that works real well. But a lawn isn't like a forest. Think of a forest when it starts to rain. You could be in a forest when it's raining and it never reaches you.
Yeah, you don't get wet necessarily.
Because all those leaves are getting coated with water, and that water's being held back. Every little nook and cranny where water builds up in a little pool is holding back water from floodwaters. You remove the trees, you make surfaces that are very hard and it flows off quickly, and that water is just flushing through the system very rapidly. The second thing is that when it goes through the system fast, there isn't the chance to remove sediment, there isn't the chance to remove pollutants from the water, so what you're running into is that water isn't the greatest water as far as quality is concerned. So that's the second thing, is maintaining the ability for the water to cleanse itself in those various parts on the surface, groundwater, and in the riparian zone.
Okay. Paul, what would be a good example of a successful watershed conservation?
9 Mile Run.
9 Mile Run
here in
Pittsburgh.
In Pittsburgh, Wilkinsburg, Penn Hills. It's a very, very large watershed. And at one time, storm sewers were all put into it, and it was culverted, and the idea was to get stormwater out of the system as quickly as you possibly can. What the 9 Mile Run Watershed Association is doing is providing people with rain barrels. You have to buy them. That catches the water from your roof of the house puts it into a big rain barrel that holds 70 gallons of water with a little hose at the bottom. So suddenly all that rainwater fills the thing up and then slowly drains out of the hose and drains into your garden. It feeds your garden and drains down into the groundwater. So that rush of water during storm events isn't all of a sudden into my 9-mile run, but that rush of water is slowly released. That's what needs to happen. That we need to replicate the original forested systems where the leaves were holding back the water. We don't have tree leaves as much as we used to have, so now we need to have rain barrels to collect it and then slowly release it.
Well, it's always a pleasure to spend time with our esteemed naturalist, Paul Wiegman, and listening to him, you can understand why he's so esteemed. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Matthew.
And you're listening to the Allegheny Front.
Off we go into the sunset.
I think that was lovely.
That worked out. It always works out so nicely.